So our mission is to reclaim God's intended reality. In order for us to understand what it means to reclaim God's intended reality, we first have to understand what was God's intended reality. How did he design this whole thing to work and to function? How did he put things and pieces in place? What does it mean for us to be humans to the fullest? What does it mean for us to have meaning and purpose in this life? Well, if you go back to Genesis 1 and 2, you have the original commission, which we just talked about, but you also have this picture. There's this order and there's this hierarchy that's put into place in the very beginning in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. This is an order and hierarchy that the Jewish people would call shalom. Now, shalom is this really interesting word. It's a big, bold, beautiful, layered sort of word. Shalom can mean hello, it can mean goodbye, but it can also be used for a much deeper sense of meaning. Shalom can mean fulfillment, it can mean wholeness, it can mean completeness, it can mean unity, it can mean oneness. It's this big, layered sort of word. And so when you go through the story of Genesis 1 and 2, you see a picture of shalom. And in this picture of shalom, there is this order and this hierarchy to the whole thing. So, for example, the story begins with God. Obviously, in the beginning, God began to create. So God creates, and he creates everything on the earth, the universe, everything that is known to us in this life and in the world we live in. He begins to create the light, the dark, the trees, the sands, the oceans, the fish, the people, the whatever. So you have God, and then God creates. And then before God takes his rest, he creates this really unique being. And we'll talk about this more later. But he creates this really unique being that is man, that is you. And then, before God takes his rest, God endows man with certain authority, right? This is part of the original commission. God says to man, you will be fruitful and multiply. He says, you will rule and subdue the earth. He says, you will work and care for the garden. These all carry meaning to what it is as humans to have purpose in this life. And so when you see this order, this is a picture of what shalom looks like. This is the picture of God's intended reality, the way he designed things to work. There's God, there's man, and then there's creation. Now, if you've been around the church, if you're familiar with these sorts of things, you know that this order, this shalom, doesn't last for long. In fact, if you get into the 3rd chapter of Genesis, you see things get a bit messy. Things get a bit out of order. God's intended reality gets disrupted. And so what you have is a story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and they eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? There's one tree that God says, don't touch that. Everything else is for you to understand who God is, but don't eat of that tree. And so what do? Of course, they eat of the tree. So man, essentially in that moment, God's will says, hey, I've given you the earth. It's all for you, but don't eat the tree. This is the order, right? So man has the proper relationship and understanding of God. Man has the proper understanding of the self, and then man has the proper relationship to the earth that we live on, this role of stewardship. So when God says don't eat the fruit, and then they eat the fruit, what man is essentially doing is placing their will over the will of God, which means now it's the hierarchy is out of order. It's the order has been disrupted. I mean, anytime we disrupt God's intended reality, this is what happens. We have this disruption. In fact, this is what some may even call sin. Sin essentially is a disrupting of God's intended reality. It's a disrupting of the hierarchy and the order that God created things to be in. Another example would be, if I live my life in such a way that I choose the things of this world, that I want to pursue finances and big houses and fancy cars, and the end-all be-all is having more and more stuff, then I've put the things of this life and this world above the things of God, which then again puts me out of the hierarchy, out of the order that God has created for me to be in.